What's up everyone? Welcome to the channel. My name is Chris. I post mountain bike and ski related videos, so if you're into that sort of thing, be sure to subscribe to follow along for more. But in today's episode, I'm going to talk to you about my Rockshox Flight Attendant. I have the Sid Ultimate and the Sidluxe Ultimate kit from my Specialized Epic Evo Gen 7. So without any further ado, let's dive into the details and I'll tell you what I think of this new suspension. So I've been riding the Flight Attendant system now for about a year, and before I dive into the details of the Flight Attendant system, I want to first share my thoughts on the suspension performance itself. So I was previously riding a Sid Select Plus, the 2021 model year, before upgrading the suspension. And I also had the Sidluxe Select Plus rear shock that came stock on the bike as well. So performance-wise, the new Debon Air Spring and the new Sid Ultimate is night and day different versus the Sid Select Plus that I had before. It is much less harsh feeling and it has a much more plush feel, which gives you more traction out on the trail. It almost feels more like a Pike than a Sid from the previous generation. It really is that good. In addition, the race day damper is next level awesome. Compared to the Sid Select Plus that I was using before, this is just so much more damped and controlled through all the rough terrain and roots and rocks that we have here in the East Coast. It really does perform awesome. Setup for the Sid Ultimate was super easy. There's just a rebound dial that you can control the settings with, along with the Flight Attendant system settings. But I found it super easy to set up and I got along with it pretty much right out of the box. So I'll post my settings right here. For reference, I am 180 pounds and I ride pretty aggressively in some East Coast technical single track. Now the Sidluxe Ultimate feels much more similar to the Select Plus that came on the bike from the factory. There is a noticeable difference in the larger hits though. It feels much more composed when you're really just plowing into some larger rocks or bigger roots and just taking bigger hits. It feels much more composed in those situations. It seems to recover faster, so it doesn't get overwhelmed and sort of lose control of the damping when you have those larger impacts. It really just motors right through them now with the new Sidluxe Ultimate in the rear. But it feels much more similar than the fork did. The fork was night and day difference. Before you can use the Flight Attendant system, you first have to set it up and calibrate it, which is a super easy process on the SRAM Axis app. It took me at most 5 minutes to do. It really is that easy. I'm not going to share all the information as to how to do that because there's great videos out there by SRAM already or Rockshox. But just know, even if you're not the most computer savvy, it's very easy to set up. It basically involves tilting the bike, pushing a few buttons on the suspension itself, pairing it with your power meter. That's about it. I first want to explain how I have it set up on my bike, sort of the basics behind it, and then we'll dive into what I truly think of the system itself. So Flight Attendant controls the compression damping of the fork and the rear shock. It can control them independently, and the fork is sort of the master control unit here. It takes input from all of your Axis components that you have. For me, I just have a Quark power meter, and that is enough. It works really well with that. But you can integrate your dropper post, your transmission, all of those things will feed into the fork's controller here and just gives it more data to work with. So it should work theoretically even better in those, if you have all those Axis components. But in my experience, just the power meter works great. So you have different bias modes that you can set. So it'll tend to be softer or firmer, anywhere from -2 up to +2. +2 being the firmer suspension settings. Typically, I leave it in around the 0 bias mark if I'm going to do a smoother cross-country race. You know, I'll up it to +1 or even +2 if it's a super, smooth and fast course. And if it's really rocky, I'll even go lower. I'll go -1, or if I'm just going to go out for a fun trail ride, I'll do -2. So I do play with the bias settings. It's very easy to do. You can just basically push this button twice here on the fork and then go through your suspension settings with the plus and minus right here on the fork, as well as the Axis app allows you to control all of that. So super easy to do. Now, as far as setting up the suspension, you no longer have to compromise between pedaling efficiency and downhill performance. You can just set up your suspension to perform as best as you can downhill because it's going to lock itself out every single time that you go to pedal or apply any real effort on the bike. It just stiffens itself up, which is honestly great. If you're a more downhill oriented rider, I mean, you can set up your suspension to be like the most plush, ripping downhill bike and then just know as soon as you go to pedal uphill, it's just going to firm up and basically become a fully rigid cross-country bike that rip up the hills on. It's awesome. So the way that the bike determines which suspension setting to be in, Flight Attendant will take information from your power meter and this main fork controller here. It determines whether you're going up a hill, down a hill, whether the bike is being leaned over into a corner, as well as just the amount of vibration or movement from the chassis. So it senses whether, you know, your fork and controller here is being jostled around, and it will tend to be saying, hey, it's a rougher terrain, I should probably stay in more of an open setting during this. Or maybe you're hammering on the pedals and it's like, all right, well, we're in a really high effort zone now. We're going to begin to lock out, even though we're in a rougher terrain. So it takes all that information into account and kind of puts you in the most optimized setting based on its parameters, and it works really well. Now it can control the fork and rear shock independently. So the fork can be in open pedal locked, you know, and this rear shock can be in any setting that it wants. You know, a lot of times I will find that the bike is in open on the front and pedal in the rear when I'm climbing up something that's a bit more technical and rough, just to maintain a firm pedaling platform and then have all of the suspension traction that you need. So for a little background, before using Flight Attendant system, I did not have a mechanical lockout on this bike. The Sidluxe Select Plus I had before was just a basic 2-position shock, so it was really just kind of open and firm. I pretty much always just ran it in the open setting and the fork as well. So when I came to use the Flight Attendant system for the first time, it was immediately apparent the efficiency benefits of using a locked out suspension. For the climbs, just standing up and pedaling on the bike, you know, when it fully locks out, it really does feel like a fully rigid hardtail bike. You can just really hammer on the pedals and not lose any efficiency at all through the suspension. It is awesome. It really changes how the bike feels, makes it feel much more sporty and reactive, especially in a climbing situation. Now, what I noticed on my first ride with the Flight Attendant system is that it had not learned what my power zones were. So it wasn't quite sure when to lock out, when to go into pedal mode, when to open up. And it does take the system a while to learn all these things, but on the first ride, this was more noticeable. It was less eager to stiffen up the suspension, but it was still very eager to open it up. So as soon as I would lean the bike into a corner, the suspension would open. As soon as I'd point the bike downhill, hit the first sort of root or rock, suspension would open. Basically, as soon as I stopped pedaling, the suspension wanted to be open, which as a more gravity-oriented rider, I really appreciated that feature. So the suspension does default to the open setting, and then it just stiffens it up as you're pedaling harder or as you're going up a steep grade. Now, I had heard that the Rockshox Flight Attendant system was very quick to change modes, but I was still surprised at how quickly it does this out on the trail. So in a situation where I'm rolling rather quickly across flat ground, I'm pedaling hard, the bike's in pedal mode, I could hit a big root or rock with the front tire, and by the time the rear tire gets to it, it's fully unlocked and open, ready to absorb that root or rock and keep traction and allow you to keep maintaining power through that situation. It was really incredible how fast it reacted, and I never felt like I was in the wrong suspension setting or that it was closed when I wanted it to be open. It was extremely fast in that situation. Now on the first ride, I did notice some noises coming from the suspension, basically little robot noises as it changes the damper settings, but it's not anything that is an annoyance to me. I think it's something that you'll get used to, and I actually did get very used to. I barely even hear it now or even notice it. So as I said, I've been using this Flight Attendant system for about 1 year now, and the robot noises no longer bother me at all. But more importantly, the Axis system, Flight Attendant, has learned my power zones. I just allowed it to basically do its own thing. I never set them manually. I just allowed Flight Attendant to figure out what those power zones were. And it's incredible how well it knows the way that I ride. Almost a little scary. It feels like the bike knows when I'm going to start pedaling before I even do it, and it firms up the suspension and locks it out, or it does it almost immediately. Really cool how it develops the power zones on its own. You don't have to input any of that data manually into the system. It just knows whether you're pedaling hard, easy, and there's, I think, 5 different power zones that it'll show. I'll put an example of that right up here on the screen so you all can see. Now, it is constantly changing modes. On the East Coast single track that we have here, it's very up and down and punchy. So using a mechanical lockout there's zero chance that I would be changing the suspension settings as often as this is. And I think on one of the Pink Bike articles that I was reviewing before purchasing this, it said that Nino Schurter's suspension with Flight Attendant changed like 1,000 times during one of his races. And honestly, that's pretty accurate in my experience. It is constantly changing modes. So it's always in the perfect suspension setting. Yeah, it's really learned my effort zones, and it always is in the right zone, just somehow. It's just incredible. Without the Flight Attendant system, the bike honestly feels slow to me now. It is that much of a difference with Flight Attendant versus without Flight Attendant, at least with this suspension platform. The Epic Evo Gen 7 has a bit more of an active rear suspension than a traditional cross-country bike because it was originally designed as a down-country bike at the time. I plan to do some time testing to show you what the difference is with Flight Attendant and without Flight Attendant, basically no lockout at all. Rockshox does claim that it's like 2% difference between the Flight Attendant system and a mechanical lockout. So I'm sure they did lots of testing to back that up. So we're just gonna rely on that for, the difference between mechanical and the Flight Attendant system. But as far as no lockout versus lockout, the most optimized lockout you can get, I'm really interested to see how much faster the bike is with the Flight Attendant system. So be sure to subscribe. I'm gonna put up a video of that here shortly, and we'll get nerdy with all the testing details there. Now, I've mentioned some of my favorite things or how much I like the Flight Attendant system, but there are a few things that I would like to see improved on this. First of all, anytime you touch the bike, you can see that it begins to light up, which means the Flight Attendant system is now active and awake and alert. So as you drive to the trailhead, as the bike's jostling around, it will actually wake up and it can drain your batteries. So if you're going on a very long trip and you leave the bike on the back of your rack, drive 4 hours out there, the batteries could be dead by the time you get there. So it's very important to use these little red plastic covers, and they just basically replace where the batteries go so that your suspension system is not dead when you get there. There is an example of this where I took the bike with me to work one day and it was a windy day, and the bike just moving on the rack from the wind was enough to keep it awake during the day, and it actually drained the battery. So when I went to ride in the afternoon, the system was just totally dead. So definitely be aware of that as one of the issues. And one of the things I'd like Rockshox to do is just to create a travel mode. So you can just basically on the Axis app say, all right, go to sleep and don't wake up. And then when you get to where you want to ride, you can say, all right, now you can turn on. I think that would be a very good solution, but I will say they've made some firmware updates at this point, and it turns off much quicker. As you can see, it's already turned off in just the time that I've been talking. Before, it would stay on for like 10, 15 minutes, and it would really drain the battery down quickly. The second issue that I've had with Flight Attendant is just in cold weather. Batteries just don't work in cold weather. It's just the way the chemistry is. So there's nothing that they can really do besides just change the battery type. But I was out for a ride in a 10-degree Fahrenheit day. The battery status was green, totally fully charged up before the ride, and they died about 30 minutes into the ride just because it was too cold for them to actually stay awake and operate the system. So just to be aware of that, if you ride in really cold climates, it's not going to work very well for you. Now, if your batteries are low and you go to grab the bike, the Axis app will actually give you a low battery indication on your phone, just as it would with any of the other Axis components. It just sends you an alert on your phone, hey, your batteries should be replaced or charged, and it keeps you from getting to the trailhead and realizing that your batteries are dead, which is a nice feature of the Axis app. Now, the battery life itself is pretty good. I never really feel like I need to, keep on top of it. It's just kind of like a maintenance item at this point, I guess you could say. I don't charge it after every single ride. I probably charge it every 4 rides, and at that point, it's probably still in like the green zone. So I think you are going to get roughly 10, maybe 12 hours of use out of it. Of course, it depends how many times your suspension is changing settings. The more times it's changing settings, the less battery life you're going to get. But I raced the Shenandoah Mountain 100K, roughly an 8-hour race. And I never had any issues with the battery draining down during the race and not operating. By the time I got to the end, the battery status was still green. And I think I did a ride like the next week or something, and it was like maybe in the yellow after that. But you have plenty of battery life. I would say anywhere over 10 hours of usage in most situations. So it's not something that you need to charge every ride. Maybe just do once a week or even once a month, depending on your ride frequency. Now, everything else on this bike is 100% mechanical, so the batteries are just one extra thing that I do need to keep track of. But if I do forget to charge the batteries, the suspension just defaults to open. So essentially, I still have a perfectly functioning bike that I can go ride. It's not like my bike's not going to shift because I forgot to charge my batteries. It's just my suspension's not going to be optimized for every situation. But I've never ran into a situation where I forgot to charge the batteries, besides the one day I mentioned at work where they drained down during the day, but I never have forgotten to charge them. It's super easy to do. If you can keep track of your phone, you can keep track of charging your bicycle's batteries. It's not really that big of a deal. The only other thing I would like to comment on in the suspension is if you're standing up and pedaling in the open mode and you begin to pedal and kind of just you're stomping on the pedals, the suspension will recognize that as suspension movement, and it tends to stay in a softer setting during that time. That is only when the bias is in a lower setting, so like 0 or even -1. If you were to set the bias at +1 or +2, in those situations it does just quickly firm up. But just something to be aware of is that it not only reads the trail movement, but it also reads your input into the bike and just the bike's movement in general when it determines what suspension setting to be in. Now, that's really all the complaints that I have of the Flight Attendant system. Overall, this suspension system is the best thing to happen since won by drivetrains or dropper posts for XC-oriented riders. And I think you'll see more applications for enduro and even downhill you're seeing on the World Cup circuit, where electronically controlled suspension settings just make a lot of sense. Now, it is expensive. To me, it's worth it. It's something that I was willing to invest in and use for a long time. I've had zero reliability issues with this suspension system so far. So it has been proven to be pretty reliable over this past year, and I hope that it continues to be reliable. Now, my favorite things about the suspension system is the performance of the fork and rear shock, just to begin with, is outstanding. It's super fast to change suspension modes, always making sure that you're in the correct setting to be the fastest. Additionally, there's no extra cables to route through your bike. My Specialized Epic Evo only has 3 cable ports here in the front of the frame, and one's being used for the rear brake, one's being used for the dropper, and the other's being used for the derailleur. So they're all full, and if I wanted to stuff a 4th cable in to operate the rear shock lockout, I would have to take out this rubber grommet and just kind of stuff a bunch of cables through and just clutter the front of the bike up. So in that sense, it's nice not to have to add an extra cable to the bike when there's already so many. The suspension system's just been reliable. I mean, I can just basically show up and ride. And, I don't have to take any extra actions to maintain the cables or, it's just basic suspension service. Do your 50 hours fork and rear shock when it's due and just go ride your bike. Ride experience wise, you're not twisting your wrists, going for open pedal lock. You don't have to think about that. You just get on your bike and just ride. It is a true, it's the purest riding experience that you can have. I mean, that's what you want, is you just get on your bike and just become one with it and ride and know that your bike's gonna, be there for you and react in the way that you want it to in every situation on the trail. And you don't have to think about it. Flight Attendant just does it for you. So it's pretty great. Would I buy it again? Yeah, absolutely. The Specialized Epic Evo Gen 7 was born as a downcountry bike originally, so it has a bit more of an active rear suspension, and the Flight Attendant system just pairs perfectly with that. I mean, this bike absolutely rips now. It's basically a true cross-country weapon at this point, because when it's in the open setting, the bike is super plush. It feels like a trail bike, and then once it firms up, it basically becomes a full-on XC race bike. It's kind of the best of both worlds. So I plan on keeping this bike for a long time, using the Flight Attendant system. So yeah, I'd recommend this suspension system to anyone who wants to, improve their bike's performance. It's one of the best suspension upgrades that you can make on a bike that you intend to pedal hard. Now, if you're just kind of motoring up to the top of a climb, like on your enduro bike, maybe you don't really care that much. But on my cross-country bike, I really want it to pedal and just, scoot up the climbs as fast as it can. And it does that now with the Flight Attendant system. So yeah, I would really recommend it to anyone who prioritizes uphill performance or just wants to have a bike that feels fast and efficient. So that's gonna wrap up my thoughts on Flight Attendant. Be sure to subscribe. As I said, I'm gonna do some time testing here in the future, so you don't wanna miss out on that video. And yeah, follow along for more. See you next one.